One evening, sitting on the balcony watching the stars and city lights, I wanted to read a pocket-sized book which was almost begging me to look at it again. Once I was involved with a group conducting mind transference experiments from Perth with another based in Melbourne. The one in Melbourne was interested in the esoteric aspects of extraterrestrial communication. Dr. Ian Gordon, Ph.D., was chairing the Melbourne group, but I preferred to remain anonymous. Ian has written a number of books, and his first one was The Andronicus Tapes, Communication with Higher Intelligences. As he explains, there in Andronicus is a higher intelligence existing in the upper reaches of the cosmos. In 1982, they communicated through a psychic medium to a group of people in Melbourne about the future of Earth and prophecies for coming decades. Andronicus encouraged them to write that book, and Dr. Ian Gordon made it possible. Later, waking up from my slumber on the balcony at sunrise was quite unusual. Luckily, the night was reasonably warm, and there was no rain. There were not many people around that morning except Elizabeth, who decided to surprise me by visiting, for she said she was shopping in the area at that early hour. When I made mention of what I decided to do in regard to going back to Melbourne, she showed great interest for me to at least parent her sons. I suggested that she should speak to her brothers in Sydney, for I had no desire to be responsible for anyone's welfare issues at this time. She was trying really hard to become a part of my life, and provided me with her brothers' addresses and phone numbers, so that I could be in touch with them if I made my way there. After hearing my intention to go back to Victoria, Lee started urging me to help him come to Melbourne. He had never had the chance to see Melbourne until then, and wanted to leave his traumas behind. He just wanted to get away, even if it was for a short time. Deep down, I knew he would become homesick in a short while, insisting on going back to his mother and sister. I was not happy about becoming responsible for anybody other than my own self, for it could present a few undesirable problems, and he would need to be housed and looked after. Although he was a very gentle and adaptable young individual, he was not yet mature enough. To begin with, I needed to accommodate myself and establish some form of employment, or start my own business in a suburb suitable to my artistic interests. Accommodating an extra person was going to try my resources heavily. However, in case he wanted to stay with me permanently, as if he was my son, I would have additional responsibilities for his education or apprenticeship. I light-heartedly told him that he could come with me, but he needed to talk to his mother and sister first. One evening, after my tea and relaxing with a television program, Lee came urgently knocking at the door, shouting frantically to let him in. I was shocked. He immediately wanted me to close the door, shuddering and extremely fearful, obviously frightened of something and needing immediate protection. I told him to relax and tell me all about it before I involved the police. He was unable to speak at first, for he was petrified of his father. Then he rushed to the balcony, trying to see if his dad was still around, with a big, sharp knife in his hand. The situation lasted for a while before he was reasonably calm. While sipping his tea, he said, "Malfunction wants to kill me, chasing me all the way. He may have seen me come here." I recommended that we notify the police immediately about his father's behavior, chasing and threatening him with a knife. I rang the police, and the officers told me that they were going to look into the matter after obtaining information from Lee. Then they asked if it was all right for me to accommodate him for the night. Spending a night with someone else's youngster was very unusual for me, for I never had this kind of experience before, although he could sleep on the portable bed in the spare room. Being a very private person, I could not sleep that night, having somebody else in the house. After hearing many stories of the ugliest kind, anybody would be cautious, and so questions started to do their dance. What if he had strange addictions, or intended to take things I worked very hard for? I stayed on the balcony, watching the stars, wondering what to do next. Then I contemplated that he was not somebody like that, but if this was to become a semi-permanent situation, what could one expect? This episode reminded me of my unfortunate past with my own father when I was young. Knowing I was planning to go back to Melbourne, Lee asked me again to take him away from his father's tyranny, and he would do anything I asked him to do. It was truly sad, for I would never ask for anything the way some might have expected, and told him that he could come with me by all means, but later he might experience homesickness for his mother and sister if things were not the way he was accustomed to or hoped for. He could not contain his joy and excitement. He stayed at my place for several weeks, behaving unusually well. He said he was going to talk with his mother about his intention to go with me when I was finally to fly to Melbourne. He certainly had his reasons, his own dreams, other than running away from his father, probably hoping to get his sister and mother to Victoria as well. At this stage, I did not know if they had their own home or were renting. Maybe moving from Perth would be impossible for them, but I did not say anything. When his mother called me on the telephone, she asked if it was all right for Lee to come with me. She said that Lee really admired me and wished I was his father. It was impossible not to miss the anxiety she was experiencing. However, we all have our shortcomings, and therefore it was possible he would discover I was not what he imagined me to be. Imagine, for example, when and if I met my own son and had a girlfriend, how would he react to other people's observations and their ungrounded judgments when they saw us two guys together? There were times when he asked me if I would adopt him as my son. It was extremely tempting, for I lived with a dream of having a son. But my own had been literally abducted, and I had no idea where he was. At least having an adopted son might fill that gap. But would it? Would I still be legally on the right track? I contacted the appropriate departments and was satisfied that everything was in order, as long as his mother agreed with the situation. At first, I was not decisive to commit myself into this venture, but simply accommodate him for a while, because one could never be certain what the next day was going to be like, and also because I had to re-establish myself. Pondering further, I believed that his traveling to Melbourne with me was not going to present problems in the immediate future. He was very excited and happy about going to Melbourne, but some of his previous queries could spoil the scene. That is, if they were not simply just passing thoughts and nothing more serious. But when he spoke about the possibility of close affection among men, as it could have been between King Arthur and Merlin, I was disturbed. Since it was not my interest, I did not want to be overly concerned about it. His father was completely anti him, apparently hoping to hurt his son to teach him a lesson. His running away from the family home and wanting to stay with me was indeed very tragic. When it was legally confirmed, it was easier for me to accommodate him, but how was he going to behave in the long term? He would probably display his natural tendencies like other normally developing teenagers, and I could probably cope with it, although I always preferred to live on my own within my personal space, especially after my real-life experiences with a family which was completely dedicated to Jehovah's Witness ideals, and I found it intolerable when others intruded into my private life. When staying with me, Lee would have his own bedroom and study, but the kitchen would be shared. However, my musical interests might present problems for him. Would he enjoy classical music, for instance? As long as he did his own thing and did not interfere with my hobbies, there would be no conflict of interest, and it could work. His mother confirmed that she was very happy with this arrangement. Sadly, she might have thought that anything was better than seeing her son suicidal, with his father's intolerable attitude towards him. Once again, life circumstances were not allowing me to primarily deal with my personal issues. Maybe it was to occupy my mind and keep me in one piece. After our meal one evening, we were sitting in the lounge when he suddenly shouted in excitement that he saw a UFO. I curiously looked through the window, but could not see anything at first, and sat on the balcony. After a while, he joined me, and we started conversing about what he had noticed in the sky. A little later, he sighted another one, and I also became aware of it a few seconds later. We both observed that brilliant object, but as it came closer, we discovered it was a light aircraft, which had many lights under its wings, displaying words advertising local businesses. We both wondered if the other objects we have seen previously were the same, just advertising. After deciding to leave it for now, since what we needed to know was already proven, he said he wished they were real alien craft, but they were not. While staying just a little longer there, gazing at the stars, shortly before midnight we saw yet another object in the sky, which looked like a plasma ball, presenting the most beautiful cobalt blue light with a rose-red glow within itself. At times it appeared to be made of metallic and a glass-like transparent material, silently floating very low above the city's skyline. If I would have seen it only by myself, I would think of it as being imagined, but both of us witnessed it exactly the same way. It descended lower over the city and remained there stationary for a few short seconds, then started to move towards us, passing us by rather slowly. As it came closer towards us, we were very excited, and Lee was almost frozen in time and motionless. I do not think I was any different, and thought for a brief moment that they were coming to visit us as they descended still further, and the details of the craft became more visible. Lee was going to tell all about it to his sister and mother. I wondered if others had also noticed what we witnessed that evening. We became aware of randomly moving globular lights surrounding the circumference of the rounded craft, and we were wide awake. A little later he told me he had again spoken with his mother about me going back to Melbourne, and she contacted me once more over the phone to see if it was true. Lee was certainly very keen about going with me. During the following few days she constantly asked me if it was all right for Lee to come to Melbourne. She probably needed some assurance that Lee was not going to be miserable, asking me to forgive him for his childish dreams about seeing flying objects in the sky. I reassured her she had nothing to worry about. Ironically, if I said something like this to my ex-wife and children, who were under her complete control with their thoughts, actions, and interests, they would immediately claim that such sightings could only be signs from the devil, and were simply lies. Naturally, Mother always knew best, and Dad, not being in that truth, could only do the devil's bidding. They would never listen to reason or any explanation of things on my part. This young man, however, was willing to learn things from me, and that was refreshing. Besides, when two or more people experience something extraordinary, which is a tangible event, and a proof in itself, how could one deny the existence of it so easily, claiming it to be just a lie? Furthermore, Lee was interested in some of the foods I prepared, liking them. Yet I found myself trying to adopt a dietary habit similar to his for a short period of time. That surprised me a lot, but it was easier to encourage him to eat healthier. Being of English background, as he put it, he preferred to eat no vegetables or variety of fruits. However, when those vegetables were incorporated in cooking, as with soups, rissoles, and others, he was happy. When he discovered me washing myself often and on a daily basis, he was utterly surprised, as he claimed, "But too much washing like that cannot be healthy. We never do it like you do." He said that it was like wasting one's time, but soon started adopting such habits which I grew up with. My involuntary involvement with him was probably doing a world of good for his personal development. There were certain limits to this. He was not my flesh and blood son, but a young person needing plenty of tolerance, understanding, patience, and some adult supervision. I was happy to help him for a while, hoping he would not be disappointed later, because I might be a little harsh with my words, as my children used to tell me from time to time, although I always aimed to be very gentle with them. However, Lee's logical behavior and attitude towards others was remarkable. He often told me all about his dreams, about his life during ancient times, and particularly about those of King Arthur. He spoke as if he was recalling memories of his past, and believed the famed wizard of those days was helping him and his then-father. In addition to this, he said he felt closer to me than his own parents, and therefore believed I could only be that wizard reincarnate on earth, encouraging me to question where he had learnt about it. Later he admitted unexpectedly how much he loved me, and then apologized in case he might have offended me with his words. He told me he was hoping that I loved him equally. I was surprised and, in a sense, shocked by this, as I hoped this love he felt was simply like the ones we know of as being between fathers and sons. Did he by any chance mean this type of love? Personally, I could love him only as if he was my son, but if he had been a girl, then I would treat her as if she was my daughter, for I never had daughters I could truly be their parent, or who could accept me as I was. Indeed, I had 2 daughters from my so-called marriage, but they never treated me like their father, not even as a human being, due to indoctrination by their all-knowing and allegedly truth-loving mother, in whose eyes I was the devil himself, for being disfellowshipped by their allegedly utterly righteous and God-chosen judicial committee. Although not naming her emotions against me, allegedly the witnesses, following Christ's wise words to love one another, Magda proved how bitter and hateful she was towards me. Following her close associates' advice, she turned the children against me in the name of supposed spiritual love. Lee and I took some time to make the necessary arrangements, packed our belongings, and employed the services of a transport company, which was going to store them until we were ready for delivery. It cost some amount of money, but that was the only clean way to deal with the issue. I felt somewhat saddened about my musical instruments, particularly my baby grand, as I was going to be unable to use them for a little while. But until we were housed in Melbourne, this was the best thing to do. I decided that we take a bus trip to Victoria, for it would create the impression of taking a holiday for Lee, and gradually prepare him for Melbourne. For him, it was like a great adventure. He was ecstatic, and it was something new. He took his small camera and kept capturing photographic impressions all the way. He often kept to himself, and from time to time spoke to me about his excitement. He also experienced life in Kalgoorlie, and on arrival in Siduna, he could not believe how people were drinking saltwater tea and coffee there. When we arrived in Adelaide, he was bewildered by what he saw, fascinated with the size of the city, with its wide streets, cathedrals, and tall buildings. At this point, he started curiously asking me if Melbourne was similar, and when we finally arrived in Melbourne, he could not believe his eyes. He exclaimed that he felt as if we had accidentally arrived in one of those big American cities he was accustomed to seeing on television. He could not imagine the vastness of the city and the tall buildings. He felt Perth was like a midget compared with other large cities, and it was not like people spoke of. He had a thin booklet produced by Perth City Council with the title Living in Perth, but he scribbled his own words on the top of it, Dying in Perth. I was happy for his first time ever adventure into Melbourne. On the other hand, I had minor concerns about how the whole story would unfold. Norman Vincent Peale interprets my long-time feelings in his words: believe in yourself, have faith in your abilities. Without humble but reasonable confidence in your own powers, you cannot be successful or happy. In short, have courage and walk life's pathway with determination and confidence, for you have the power to do so. There are many opportunities in life, but we have to be prepared to make use of them in a very positive sense. Whitney Young Jr. proclaims, "It is better to be prepared for an opportunity and not have one than to have an opportunity and not be prepared." Perhaps a little curiosity would take us further into the heights. Therefore, I will say, curiosity must never be stopped, but be guided. The young painstakingly question things like many of us used to do when we were children. In every adult dwells a child who often becomes suppressed as if it never existed, curiosity dulled, and everyday life lived in the most monotonous way one can imagine. People who never question, never wanting to know anything, or perhaps living as dictated by someone else, would never know the joy of discovering. They would never know how to be happy like children are by nature. They grow old fast, with memories they would rather never have, and are expected to act according to their age throughout their lives, believing everything they are told. Magda insisted on never allowing the children to be curious about anything other than the same old stories in the Bible. Was that how humans were envisaged to live? Was this what religious dogma was to lead people into becoming? Were they meant to be simply one-track-minded about life and everything in the world as interpreted by their belief systems of high ignorance? There is some absurdity in action today, as it has been throughout man's arduous history. Lee was a very curious youth, inquiring about all kinds of things. One thing is clear: today's generation is more interested in knowing and discovering. This thought alone made me realize I was not alone in thinking that it was far better to question things and not follow unnecessary restrictions inflicting humanity within known religious societies of the world. It is surely far better to be free to think, to invent, and courageously try to understand what seems impossible. In my case, that was one of the reasons I preferred to eliminate the usual fears we as humans experience when wanting to do something useful or achieve a goal. Whenever my art students ask me how they can draw a straight line on a piece of paper when they could only do crooked ones, I always encourage them to do just crooked lines for now. When we cannot make the first step, how can we contemplate walking a mile? Do you remember that very first kiss when you were falling in love? Do you remember how you felt when you experienced your first dance? Now in Melbourne, both Lee and I needed temporary accommodation so that we could put our loads somewhere secure and walk into the city. After arriving at Spencer Street train station, as it was then known, we walked towards King Street. Although it was not a good idea to carry our belongings all the way, we had to take them with us, hoping to have housing somewhere soon. In a sense, it was a great blessing to come across the Salvation Army's People's Palace, the cheapest and readily available accommodation. We were previously informed that they were refurbishing the building, but if we did not mind the untidy corridors and shower recesses, using plastic dividers, we could stay there for a small fee. It sounded perfect as a temporary measure. We needed to unload our luggage in a safe place and go walking, having a meal in the city, and look for permanent housing. In fact, we could stay at this first temporary housing for a few days, and that would allow us the opportunity to find the right place. We were both given separate sets of keys to our shared room, with 2 different beds. It was not going to be easy for me because I was not accustomed to sharing a room with anybody other than my former wife and close lady friends. I felt uneasy and uncomfortable with another male in the same room. However, I was calmed by the idea that others would probably think of us as being father and son traveling together. Lee was a very shy young man and preferred to sleep in his everyday clothing. Despite all this, I was still a little apprehensive about anybody, as I pondered on some ugly stories I had heard about youths in general, wondering if he would delve into my personal belongings while I was asleep, or display uninvited behavior, although I did not experience anything like that when he stayed with me. Throughout the years, I developed a distrust of people, and it did not matter whether they were close associates or completely unrelated. He kept talking all night through about his dreams and fantasies. They were of no particular concern other than harmless thought construction in regard to his interest in olden heroes and space travel, ancient gods, and other worlds. I suppose it was partially dependent on his new adventure and excitement. The more he discovered about Melbourne, the more he fell in love with it. During our stay at the People's Palace, we always endeavored to have a good breakfast in the city before visiting real estate agencies. I also needed to establish my own business very soon in a commercially viable manner, or be employed through academia while occupying him either in the educational field or an apprenticeship similar to when he assisted me. We discovered an apartment in the middle of Toorak, which would be ideal for artistic endeavor, but the agents simply did not want to let us move in there with the excuse that we were not related, and they were very cautious regarding the delicate issues society was concerned about, even if we were father and son. I could understand their concerns, yet the attitude displayed towards me was most disgusting. I wondered what they thought of us. We were not in a homosexual relationship or in the drug trade, but there was a huge discrimination against people in those days, and being judged against my nature was highly insulting. Personally, even if I was not told anything, I was extremely good at knowing what others were thinking of me, for I habitually psychoanalyzed them. We frequented cinemas to break the monotony, and dining outside was becoming a little expensive. In truth, we had no choice other than search for suitable accommodation and some form of employment. I reapplied to the university for what I was passionate doing. For the time being, they could only employ me on a sessional basis, which would be ideal for what I ultimately wanted to do, which was to establish my own commercial art studio. Occasionally, we had a nice lunch in one of the department stores or shopping arcades. Noticing the lunchtime crowds, Lee often asked me if I had something to do with what he observed. At first, I did not realize what he was referring to, but soon it became clear that he noticed young and old, males and females, doing a dance routine when close to our table. I exclaimed jokingly that because we generated very happy thoughts, people feeling them must have thought they were listening to music, but he did not take it as a joke, and was very serious about it. That made me curious also. I observed people and discovered that what Lee was telling me was true. Indeed, people displayed such a trend, and I thought that it was probably wishful thinking. People generally feel good when they are in my presence because I greet everybody with a smile. Maybe they were sensing the friendly vibrations from us. I still wondered how it had happened on those occasions, and often in different venues. I have no answer. One other memory creeps in about Lee laughing uncontrollably about what he heard while having his shower early in the morning. He said a male voice was calling another with, "Attention, soldier!" I also heard it and thought it was a joke, but he insisted that those two men were showering together in a small cubicle. They were probably gays, for they sounded like that. Since it was not my interest, I said that perhaps they were father and son. Following this event, I saw my old friend Andreas, claiming to be a spaceman. He saw me too, but would not approach nor talk to me for some unknown reason. When an opportunity arose, I made an extra effort to talk to him, but he raised his voice and told me he did not know that I was a very dirty person and did not want to shake hands with people who loved other men's. Shocked, but in control, I explained that I was helping that young man settle in Melbourne, and I considered him as if he was my son. Andreas was calmed, and now once again talking, he said, "Ah, I remember you telling me you have sons. They must be also capitanos like you." Yet another day passed without much success in regard to housing, and I started to panic. My other friend Reg in Elwood invited me to come over with my young apprentice, where we could stay for a while, but since he was not a very healthy man, I did not want to burden him. Lee and I went to St Kilda and Luna Park, and after lunch visited Reg. He was very excited about my return, saying we no longer needed to talk over the phone and eagerly prepared sandwiches. He was also happy, for once again there was someone to talk to, for he could not express his innermost secrets to just anybody other than his Baptist minister friend and me. His health was not getting any better, but for Lee he presented yet another subject he could draw a caricature of. However, I had to make sure Reg did not see Lee's artwork for fear of offending him. Reg was still listening to the reel-to-reel tapes I had made for him, even recordings of him reading the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. I happily kept copies of those recordings for myself, for I always value my friends and always endeavor to keep their memories alive. That evening we stayed at Reg's, seated by the long chair in his lounge, Lee sitting next to me, later leaning on my right shoulder, and comfortably sleeping. But his long hair was all over my face, which was not at all comfortable. I hoped that the following evening we were going to be housed somewhere permanent, so that both of us would have our own space, and be comfortable as it once was. One of the estate agents I had known well was based in St Kilda, and listening to a constant voice in my head urging me to visit them this morning, I felt the urge to see if they had suitable housing for us. After a quick breakfast at a Glen Huntly Road cafe, we went there, and were not disappointed. Having inspected the premises at the corner of Barclay and Ackland Streets in the afternoon, we completed the necessary formalities. When the keys were in our hands, it was time to celebrate at a city restaurant. We invited Reg to join us. However, he had a yearning question, wondering who this young boy was, and what he was doing here, obliging me to explain a few things. Later he discreetly told me that my young assistant really looked so gorgeous, and he could share his bed any time. At first I took it as a joke, but later, thinking about what he had said, it shocked me. Lee had no idea about it, and later drew a few interesting caricatures of Reg. I was extremely happy about my new accommodation, right in the middle of a famous corner of Melbourne City. It was populated with art-loving, eccentric, and colorful characters, as well as music stores, markets, and a chain of restaurants. The famous Luna Park and Palais Theatre were well-known landmarks there. Tram stops and oft-frequented McDonald's family restaurants, as well as the beach, made it an ideal place to live. With the owner's approval, we painted the interior of the dwelling in neutral grey tones, and it looked really stunning as it changed its quality beautifully with the changing characteristics of the outside light. Now we could start painting works of art, teaching painting and drawing techniques to local people of all ages. This was going to provide us with opportunities to have exhibitions of classic and contemporary expressions of art, but I was also going to continue with my lecturing on a sessional basis. Occasionally we frequented shops specializing in antique swords. I developed a great interest in collecting war memorabilia and discovering Lee's interest in items of ancient art was a good start. He discovered an ancient Scots dirk in one of the souvenir shops I had been frequenting next to the town hall, which we put on lay-by for him. It was very ornamental, had its own sheath, and seemed to have dried stains resembling the color of tomato sauce. When it was finally in his hands, he was delighted beyond words. I noticed him often putting it under his pillow for some reason, and although I made no mention of it, I was worried. Remembering his background in Perth with his father, and him often being bullied by his school friends, it was ringing alarm bells, but maybe my worries were unfounded. Knowing how sensitive he was about his person caused another concern in case he would consider self-harm. Was it perhaps for self-protection, as it may have been in olden days? Another thought that passed through my mind was sending chills down my spine, for it may have been meant to be used on me, in case I assaulted him. Why, one may think I had such a thought. I can only say, as I had often been accused of all sorts of ugly things by my so-called family, it forced me to always be alert and cautious with everybody around me. I became habitually cautious and fearful of people ever since. In the past, some people I have helped with their housing needs and finding employment turned against me due to my ethnicity, but then again Lee knew I would never do something hurtful. However, I found it very difficult to determine what his mood swings would be like from one day to the next. I intended to teach him as much as I could to stand on his own 2 feet, not forgetting that I was not related to him. Several months later, everything was going reasonably well, but on occasions he noticed me being quite distressed in a dark corner of the lounge, which was also my studio. I was very emotional about my recent past, wishing that my children, particularly my son, had spent some time with me, learning things, else he and his sisters were taken away, and I had no idea of their whereabouts. I was wondering whether they knew they had been illegally taken away with many scheming attitudes, as instructed by the Jehovah's Witnesses. I was certain that they were being told their father, the evil man, had abandoned them. In complete hatred, their allegedly God-fearing and all-righteous mother only listened and heeded their most treacherous advice, following so-called God's commands issued forth by the witnesses in separating the children from their father. The poor woman was most certainly under their spell, and did not know anything better, with a mind completely emptied, and filled only with biblical texts. She could not even realize how archaic the standards of the cult were that she belonged to in segregating women, never giving them a chance to advance. The specific attitudes experienced with the witnesses to keep the children isolated at school, applying the rule of shunning the so-called unfaithful parent and separating them was taken as if being under the guidance of the Spirit. This Spirit was not of love, but adversity. It was most certainly seen as a good way to hide inappropriate witness love and affection towards young children, and Magda was blinded by the brilliant lies of this cult, supposedly in spiritual fervor. Noticing my non-verbalized sadness, Lee sat next to me, leaning on my shoulder, trying to console me, saying not to worry and things would get better. It was a very sad case indeed, and a very unusual one, as I did not want him to notice my emotions, for he had his own problems to deal with. I felt he was beginning to miss his mother and sister, and urged him to write to them, for I did not want him to experience the agony of complete separation from his family like I was. He started doing so, as there needed to be at least some communication. When I told him that he should visit his mother soon, his eyes sparkled. Then he asked something which was a great surprise to me. In the olden days, men used to love each other. They kissed and hugged each other. But have they? He continued. Can you guess what I'm saying? He was extremely excited as he uttered those words. Worryingly, I told him I considered him like my son. I could teach him things, but could not consider any other relationship, particularly in the homosexual sense. But you would kiss your son, would you not? He asked in a very shy manner. This made me wonder that perhaps his curiosity was not gender-related, and thought he wanted a filial kiss. But he was someone else's child, and for me to kiss a young person who was not related to me on his cheeks would feel very odd. Obviously, he would love to have some parental affection, and was probably desperately in need of it. But I was not accustomed to kissing others, like it is traditionally done in some countries. Nor let us not forget that I was also dealing with the concerns Margaret was loading me with, and did not care about any of my needs. At one stage, when visiting Reg, I drank some beer with him at the local pub, and regretted it, as I'm not a regular alcohol drinker. Therefore was adversely affected. I was not drunk, but was extremely worried about making a fool of myself, hoping Lee would not notice it when I got home. Lee asked me if I could help him financially to go back to Perth to see his mother, as he felt very homesick. He even added, "If you really love me, and I feel you do, help me with my flight." Although I had my own immediate expenses to pay, and could not tell him anything about them, I decided to help him with his request. I told him that we should go and get him his tickets soon. He responded with, "I knew you would help me, for you really, really love me." How could one react to something like that? He ran to me, hugging, and I gave him that little peck on his cheek, and instantly regretted doing so, as I felt his lips upon mine. I was totally surprised to hear this seemingly being a British tradition. The next day we packed his things for the journey. He left his bedding and covers in his room, like many other youngsters do, but deep inside I wished he would stay with his mother and sister, for I did not want this to develop into a more serious situation. I was also fearful what he would talk about me to his mother. I was not interested in starting a new family. At the airport we shared a meal together, and he said he had learned many things from me, and to keep his bedding at my place, as he had left it, and would return some time later. I did not hear from him for a very long time, and assumed he was now settled in Perth permanently, and hoped that it would remain that way, and was happy. From then on, I was going to concentrate on my own business and everyday life, with my own agonizing past, my own emotional pains, and my own loneliness. I could do naught else other than wish all good things for Lee, thanking him for the good times we shared. I wished and hoped that he was not disappointed. It was also when I started creating a few more works of art for exhibitions in earnest, and planned to have a series of paintings depicting parts of the world I had frequented. Often I walked to nearby cafes and drank lots of coffee while making new friends along Ackland Street. Maybe I was in need to drown my worries in those cups, and Reg used to take short walks, meeting me from time to time. He enjoyed those outings, but his health had further deteriorated. He told me that his recent medical tests showed that he had developed advanced prostate cancer in addition to his other problems, and the only chance for him to recover was a long overdue, life-saving operation. Sadly, he chose not to lose his manliness, as he put it. It was now a case of waiting for the inevitable. In fact, shortly before I made my way to Perth, he started preaching to me about the benefits of ending his life by overdosing himself with medication he collected, asking me to share the experience with him. He claimed that I had also lost what was so dear to me. Feeling obliged, I explained that I was very much for life, and chose life no matter how it was experienced, for I loved life with all its ups and downs, but could not fully comprehend why such a thought had been proposed by him. He was recommended to lose a lot of weight before any treatment could be considered, and walking was the best exercise so far. But I still ask, what made Reg think that I would go along with his suggestion of committing suicide with him? That was very sad, yet I made sure he understood that I would never share this desire of his. There have been some others who expected me to do so in the past, making me wonder what they would gain from my demise. Sadly, I knew that Jehovah's Witnesses, and particularly my ex-wife, would be pleased about my physical end, but I was not going to give her and her associates the satisfaction. I still remember when I was questioned by the authorities about why I had faked my death once upon a time, obliging me to tell them the true reality, clarifying that it was none of my doing, and without my knowledge. They questioned me about my children's name change, which did not have my written consent, and they were informed about my having vacated the earth, and therefore it was apparently all right for them to assume the mother's chosen name. As I spoke about this before, I found it very interesting for people who allegedly believe Lord Jesus' teaching the world to love one another and be forgiving to behave in such a manner. They were also commanded not to judge, for God was the only authority. I was certain that they believed the Bible's advice, the meek will inherit the earth. Were they really as meek as Magda was? In absolute reality, their meekness, acceptance, and love can be equated only to hatred, after all the ugly experiences many of us had endured with them. If you notice, they do not teach about the love of God, but fear of God. Obviously, their God expects their complete dedication in absolute terror and trepidation, for he delights inflicting them with devotional fear and not love. Do they really accept Jesus' teachings as they preach? It is hard to accept that people can be so evil, and therefore my sincere advice to those contemplating joining them is be careful and don't jump into the fire. Despite all this, I chose life over destruction. I chose love over hatred. This is who I am. For a while, I was enjoying some quiet time, painting, recording my impressions, or reading from a few interesting books onto my reel-to-reel recorder. At times I found myself talking about my own concerns, dreams, and nightmares. Recording those issues was healing, as it was helping me to look at them more objectively. For a while, at least, I completely isolated myself from a number of people, yet occasionally I met my eccentric friend Andreas in places like Australia Arcade and other prominent venues for a snack and chat. At times we also met up with Reg. Meeting those two friends was refreshing and helping in forgetting my own concerns for a short while. I could not help but wonder why I was subjected to such a lot of criticism and hatred from people towards whom I remained always truthful, whether they realized it or not. In regard to my ex-family, I have been completely segregated and in truth utterly hated for not being in the witness faith and for apparently all the evil deeds which could be expected of me as an unbeliever who conjured up evil spirits and cast evil spells to harm people. Amusingly, I must add that whenever so-called Jehovah's Witness friends encountered me, they rushed to the other side of the road to avoid the evil influence. Why was it so? Simply because I practiced psychology, which was, for the all-knowing witnesses, allegedly the practice of psychic endeavors, black magic, and spiritualism, in other words, devil worship. Maybe I had met the wrong people amongst them, who did not know any better, but all my efforts had been met with complete opposition when I attempted to converse with those who appeared to be more cognizant about the issues I raised. During my studies and practice of psychology, I never came across any of the subjects I was accused of. Such practices would not normally be regarded as being criminal, but for the witnesses, being a part of the world, supporting a political party, saluting the flag, and belonging to another belief system, could only be considered as a great crime against the God they worship. It was hard to imagine that people involved in psychic endeavors or spiritualism were judged as evildoers. Questions remain unanswered. As mentioned before, when they claim to be guided by the Spirit, do they realize that they are literally showing the world they are channeling the Spirit of God? One tends to ask, which one? Perhaps their adherers should take note of their recent declaration of not being inspired of God and that they can err, and therefore one feels like asking, how can they be Spirit-guided? According to their fundamental teachings, any spirit communication can only be evil. Likewise, a psychologist may have different viewpoints about life and understanding the nature of human beings, but he or she can never be accused of being in opposition to any supreme entity people choose to worship. In the science of psychology, nobody is judged as an evildoer, but everybody may be assisted to understand the cause of their stress, concerns, and happiness. When there is need to treat a disorder, systematic methods are utilized, and common sense prevails. The closest associates of my ex-wife, however, although preaching not to be judgmental, could only bitterly criticize everybody not belonging to their own belief system. In fact, many religious or government agencies providing great assistance to the needy have been enthusiastically condemned by these so-called righteous witnesses. Here one remembers the wise words of Chief Seattle. Humankind has woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. It is very easy to belittle anybody and criticize the endeavors of others But it is vital to remember that to be little is to be little. One hopes that those associates of my ex-partner can take note of this. While living in St Kilda, I was befriended with George and his wife, who had an old second-hand and antiques shop on the corner of Berkeley and Ackland Streets. As soon as one emerged from the unit I occupied, the second shop on the right was theirs, where one could find all kinds of treasures and interesting bargains, books and magazines of yesteryear. Antique vases particularly gained my attention in their bric-a-brac shop, and if one was really lucky, one could even find old motorcycle parts there. He offered me very old and rare long-playing records of ages ago for free, saying that I was a very kind person and very friendly with everybody. Behind his meticulously trimmed white beard, a well-educated man kept smiling, but being none too pleased about his balding head, he had new hairs transplanted in rows, which stood like miniature soldiers standing precisely in line. Bemused, he used to say how ugly it was once, and his head looked like Frankenstein's monster, but he was happy now. We shared many cups of tea in their shop, having friendly conversations on almost every subject one could imagine. Born in the Middle East, he never looked the part, and was certainly not accented, and anybody talking with him would know he was from an English-speaking background. I often used to frequent various record and bookstores, and naturally the coffee shops along Ackland Street. I am sure that I have left very pleasant memories for many people, for I was always friendly with everybody. I have also drawn caricatures of people for free, making them laugh. Many times I drew a caricature of myself and gave it to people. It became almost like my calling card. I certainly made many friends there. In one of the coffee lounges, I met a German lady and talked about the weather and people's problems in general. One day she surprised me when she cordially asked me if I was who she thought I was. She recognized me as Magda's lovely husband, who many Jehovah's Witnesses did not talk good things about. She said she was studying with some witnesses from the nearby congregation and was thinking to symbolize her dedication to Jehovah. Another time, following that encounter, she asked me to congratulate her, for she had now become a baptized sister, and told me her son was once interested in Birgit. However, apparently Magda advised her not to be involved with him. She said she was told that Magda went to Perth, and did not realize that we were no longer together as husband and wife. If she had not been told anything, she would never know what was really happening, and found it impossible to believe that I did not know my wife and children's whereabouts. Even when I was living in Perth, I had no idea that they had absconded there. Maybe the white-haired witch conjured up a biblical curse to keep me away, making sure the children were kept at a distance from the wicked. In fact, all I knew was that Magda simply took the children and vanished, but this German lady was disturbed about such an abduction, which could not be done by a God-fearing Jehovah's Witness. Who knows, she might have thought that perhaps she was wrong about her decision to be dedicated to their faith. Then again, it might not have been so, because through their forever repeated suggestions, witnesses create a mindset akin to becoming totally brainwashed within their Bible students' psychological makeup, going house to house like zombie robots, repeating forever the same words as dictated. I have witnessed it throughout the years of my association with friends who belonged to the witnesses. In saying this, I am not opposing anybody, but stating the facts without prejudice. However, something important was desperately missing in my life, and I could not pinpoint it at the time. Lecturing on a sessional basis on subjects of behavioral psychology was not enough. I contemplated starting a group for people who were keenly interested in discovering, even researching into life's intriguing questions, like myself. Why, for example, did humanity develop into its current state? What indeed changed the world into what it is today? I was keen to discover the viewpoints of ancient and modern philosophers, and so decided to find out what people were doing in mind research. I tried a few already existing small groups, with some of my friends who were involved with them. Ross was one of them, and we frequented group activities by attending free lectures. Some were presented at the Theosophical Society, others in people's private homes, with friends like Ridge. My desire was to learn what others were doing to find answers to their lifelong questions. I discovered a number of people presiding over those groups who belittled anybody who did not look like them. It reminded me of the peculiar experiences I had with people like Sister Perkins in Perth. They were those who would never allow anybody to express their thoughts and feelings. Many of them sold shadows for a fee, but there were those who felt they had finally found the right place to have their questions answered. Without any doubt in my mind, they were selling shadows while presenting similar characteristics to what one discovers amongst religious and cultist groups, always desirous to put themselves on top of a pedestal to be worshipped. Certainly, we should never attempt to change people into what we would like to see in them, for it really is not our responsibility. The only thing we can change is our own self. Change yourself, change your mindset, and the whole world will change. When the opportunity presented itself, some people I was recently befriended with wanted to start such a group activity and approached me. They all wanted to partake in research into philosophies and meditation in an unbiased way. We had many discussions with a number of friends when meeting over cups of tea at the Theosophical Society regarding this issue, and after attending some of my public lectures, they felt I was the right person to conduct such a group. I had only recently met Malek, an Egyptian woman, and her husband, a very happy Scotsman, Edgar, who were keen to start such a group in Caulfield. The name Malek translates into an angel. They intended to involve their other friends, some of whom were following a few different gurus, such as Sai Baba, and they met regularly at Malek and Edgar's. The person conducting the other group meditations, who brought his large Dalmatian, did not like competition. He was charging them a certain amount of money, and the members were not too happy to pay another group leader in addition. I was therefore asked if I would do it voluntarily. For some reason it seemed people wanted to have my services only on a voluntary basis for a very long time. But I also knew that folk appreciated more the effort put into some program when it was paid for. One wondered if those willing to have such an activity under my guidance would really appreciate it at all. Only time would tell. Edgar made a suggestion that perhaps they could provide me with donations obtained from members of the newly formed group, although not like the set fee paid to the person conducting Sai Baba-related programs. It took a little while before they could get all their friends together one late afternoon at their place for a general discussion, and when we met they showed great interest in what I spoke. I explained to them what I was intending to research into, my interest in finding ways to discover ourselves anew in the real world, and the importance of why We needed to know what changed the world into its current state. I told them about my previous experiences in mind research and meditations I conducted. Then I decided to give them a taste of a specially designed meditation, which they found extremely healing, and something they needed on an individual basis. They were so impressed that they could not wait until we started the program in earnest.